She said it so casually that I almost missed it. I had called my son to ask what time I should show up for the grand opening of his flower shop, the one I had helped him build from nothing, the one I had poured 3 years of my retirement savings into, and it was my daughter-in-law who picked up the phone. "Oh," she said. There was a pause, not an awkward one, a practiced one. "We had the opening last weekend. It was really just for close friends and family." I stood in my kitchen in Barrie, holding the phone, staring at the coffee maker. I had the sense that I should say something, but nothing came. Close friends and family. I was his father. Let me back up, because the story doesn't make sense without the beginning, and the beginning started the way a lot of things do, with good intentions and a son who could talk you into anything. My name doesn't matter much. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Sudbury, came home to the same house every night, raised 2 kids after my wife passed from cancer when they were teenagers. My daughter lives out west now in Kelowna, calls me every Sunday without fail, my son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is, even now. Moved to Barrie about 6 years ago with his girlfriend, who became his wife, and who I will simply call my daughter-in-law, because she is the kind of person who uses titles like weapons. Her name is something I've stopped saying out loud. It doesn't feel right to give her name any more space in this story than she's already taken up in my life. My son had always had big ideas. As a kid, he used to draw floor plans for restaurants he wanted to open, hotels he wanted to build. He had his mother's imagination and, unfortunately, my willingness to believe in people I love. After a few years working in landscaping, he decided he wanted to open a flower shop. Not just any flower shop. A boutique floral studio, he called it, with wedding packages and corporate accounts and a little design corner in the back where people could take classes. He sat across from me at my kitchen table in the fall of 3 years ago and walked me through the whole thing. He had a binder, printed pages. He'd done research on foot traffic in his neighborhood, looked at commercial lease rates, talked to a small business advisor at the bank. I was proud of him that day. I want to be honest about that. I looked at that binder and I thought his mother would have cried. "Dad," he said, "I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe in this. I really believe in this." His wife sat beside him and smiled and didn't say much, which I thought at the time was politeness. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I talked to my financial advisor, a woman I'd been working with for years, who told me that putting $40,000 into a family member's business was a significant risk and that I should only do it if I was prepared to consider it a gift rather than a loan. I called my son and told him I was in, but that I wanted to be clear. This was a gift, no strings, no expectation of repayment. He said, "Dad, I wouldn't have it any other way." What I didn't understand then was that no strings meant something different to his wife than it meant to me. To me, it meant I expected nothing back financially. To her, it meant I had no right to expect anything at all, including an invitation to the opening of the shop. The money went in November. By the following spring, they had signed a lease on a small commercial space just off Dunlop Street. I drove down 3 times to help with the renovation, not because they asked, but because my son called and said they could use an extra set of hands, and I was retired and I wanted to be useful. I painted 2 walls of that shop. I assembled shelving. I drove to Home Depot twice in one weekend to get the right brackets because the first ones were the wrong size. My daughter-in-law would occasionally appear with a coffee and a tight smile, and then disappear into her phone. The second time I visited during renovations, I noticed a small shift in how my son spoke to me around her. Nothing dramatic, just a kind of carefulness. He'd look at her before he answered questions. He'd change the subject when I asked about timelines. Once I said something like, "So you're thinking May for the opening?" And she looked up from her phone and said very evenly, "We haven't decided yet." Not we as in her and my son and me. We as in the 2 of them. A closed circle. I told myself I was reading into things. I drove home to Barrie and told myself that the important thing was the shop, the business, the dream my son had. Not whether I was included in every conversation. Spring turned into early summer. I heard updates in fragments, mostly through my son, who would call every few weeks to check in and occasionally mention a setback. A delayed shipment of refrigerated display units, a problem with the business insurance, a miscalculation on the first month's operating costs. Each time I listened, twice more I helped. The second time it was $8,000 for the display units because the financing fell through and they needed to pay a supplier directly. The third time it was $6,000 to cover 2 months of lease while revenue was slow getting started. I kept a simple record in a notebook. Not because I expected repayment, just because I'm an engineer and I keep records of things. By the time the shop was actually operating, I had put in just over $54,000 in total, counting the initial gift. $54,000. That's not a number I throw around to make myself sound generous. It's a number I mention because it matters to what comes next. I didn't hear about the grand opening until after it happened. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not that I wasn't invited. Not even that no one told me. It's that I found out by calling to ask, and the answer was delivered so smoothly, so without apology, that I knew it had been planned. We had the opening last weekend. It was really just for close friends and family. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I called my daughter in Kelowna. She listened and then said very quietly, "Dad, that's not okay." I didn't cry. I'm 64 and I've buried a wife, and I know the difference between grief and humiliation. This was humiliation. The quiet kind. The kind that makes you feel foolish for having believed something was real. I called my son that evening. His wife answered again. I asked if my son was available. She said he was busy. I said I'd try him later. She said, "Is everything all right?" with that same smooth delivery, and I said, "I'll call back," and I hung up. My son called me back 2 days later. I asked him directly why I wasn't told about the opening. He went quiet for a moment and then said, "It was really hectic, Dad. We should have called. I'm sorry." He did not say you should have been there. He did not say, "I can't believe we didn't include you." He said hectic, and should have called, and I'm sorry. And none of it sounded like it came from him. I pulled back after that. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement. I just stopped offering. When my son called in September with a cash flow problem, the shop had good revenue but inconsistent, and a supplier had sent a larger invoice than expected, I told him I wasn't in a position to help right now. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Dad, this is important." I said, "I know." He said, "The supplier won't wait." I said, "I understand." Another pause. Then, "I'll have to talk to the bank." I said, "That sounds like the right move." He hung up shortly after. A week later, I got a call from my daughter-in-law, not my son, her. She said that they'd spoken to a lawyer about the original agreement between us, and that there was a question about the nature of the initial transfer, whether it constituted a gift or a loan, and whether my stopping financial support constituted a breach of an implied agreement. I wrote down what she said, word for word, in my notebook. Then I called a lawyer of my own. My lawyer, a quiet and methodical man in his 50s who worked out of an office on Bayfield Street, reviewed my notebook and the bank transfers and the text messages I had kept. He told me that what I was facing was not a strong legal claim. Courts in Ontario are generally reluctant to treat informal family financial transfers as enforceable contracts unless there is clear documentation of mutual obligation, but that I should be prepared for a process if they chose to pursue it. They chose to pursue it. The statement of claim arrived on a Thursday morning. My son's name was on it. I stood in my driveway in November and read it twice. The claim argued that my ongoing financial contributions had created a reasonable expectation of continued support, and that my withdrawal had caused financial harm to the business. I am not a man who has spent much time in courtrooms. I am a man who spent 31 years calculating load tolerances and drainage coefficients. I understand structures. I understand what holds weight and what doesn't. And I understood, reading that document, that this was not a legal argument. This was a message. It was designed to be expensive, to be exhausting, to make me feel that the simplest solution was to write another check and make it go away. I called my daughter in Kelowna. She offered to fly out. I told her not to yet. I called my lawyer and told him we were proceeding. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way legal disputes look on television. They were paperwork and waiting and phone calls and a mediation session in February that accomplished nothing because my daughter-in-law spent most of it with her arms crossed and her lawyer whispering in her ear. My son sat across the table from me at that mediation and looked at his hands most of the time. He looked older than I remembered. Tired in a way I recognized, because I had seen it in the mirror after his mother got sick. At one point, when the lawyers were conferring in the hallway, he looked up at me and started to say something. I waited. His wife put her hand on his arm, and he looked back down at the table. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what had happened. Not just the money, not just the opening, not just the claim, the whole shape of it. The case went to a pretrial conference in April. My lawyer had assembled every bank transfer, every text message from my son thanking me, every notation in my notebook. The judge who presided over the conference asked the opposing counsel a number of pointed questions about the evidentiary basis for their claim. She asked specifically about any documentation of mutual obligation, any agreement, written or verbal, that I had committed to ongoing support. There was none, because there wasn't one, because I had given a gift. The claim was dismissed at the pre-trial stage. My daughter-in-law's lawyer asked for costs. The judge awarded costs in my favor instead. My son called me that evening. His wife was not on the line. He said, "Dad, and then stopped. I waited. He said, "I don't know how it got here," I said. "I think you do." Another silence. Then, "She thought you were trying to control us by stopping the money." I said, "I understand why she might have felt that way, but I was never obligated, son. I helped because I wanted to, and I stopped because I needed to feel like a father, not an ATM." He didn't have anything to say to that. After a while, he said goodnight. I said goodnight. It's been 8 months since then. My daughter flew out in May, the first time she'd been back to Ontario in 2 years, and we spent a long weekend at my brother's cottage on Georgian Bay. We cooked fish and played cards, and she teased me about my terrible shuffling the way she has since she was 12. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like myself. My son and I have spoken a handful of times. Short calls, careful. He's still with his wife. The shop is still open, apparently doing well enough. I don't ask for details, and he doesn't offer them. There is a version of our relationship that still exists, and I'm choosing to tend to it slowly rather than force it. My financial advisor helped me rebalance my portfolio after the legal costs. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't nothing. I adjusted my retirement timeline by about 18 months. I still walk in the morning. I still have my coffee. I still keep my notebook, what I learned, not from the court, not from the claim, but from that mediation table, watching my son look at his hands while his wife silenced him with one touch, is that love and leverage are not the same thing. I spent 3 years confusing them. I thought that helping meant belonging. I thought that being needed meant being valued. I was wrong about that. And I think somewhere, deep down, I knew I was wrong, and I helped anyway, because he was my kid, and his mother wasn't there to help him. And I didn't know how else to be his father. I know now that I don't have to buy my way into my son's life. That's not a lesson I wanted to learn at 64. but here I am. The coffee maker is the same one I've had for 11 years. The kitchen table is the same one I've had for 11 years. The kitchen table is the same one his mother picked out at a garage sale in 2003. The house is quiet in the mornings, and sometimes I sit with my coffee and I think about that phone call. We had the opening last weekend, just for close friends and family, and I feel something that's not quite anger and not quite sadness. I think it's just the truth, finally settled in where it belongs. That's enough.